Hello, hello. Spoilers for Jujutsu Kaisen, by the way. This video will probably have a mildly clickbaity title, like I can't pronounce Jujutsu Kaisen or something. But the truth of this video is that I've been working on a Metal Gear video for about 3 months, because I'm covering the entirety of Snake Eater, and it's very literally going to be about 5 or 6 hours long, if not longer. As you can imagine, I'm slightly insane right now, and just needed to make something else. During my time writing this Metal Gear book, I decided to watch one of these famous animes that have been coming out for the past few years that I never saw. I was curious who this I'd Win guy was, so I chose JJK first over Chainsaw Man. This is an art gripe, by the way, so the footage will be primarily me drawing a character. In this case, it's the Season 3 iteration of Maki, who in many ways embodies my problems with the series, and my delights with the series. So first off, good series. Its main value to me is its animation and general art direction. You can tell the people behind the anime love making references to movie scenes and their craft in general. I've obviously made cartoons before, but that was more of a product of necessity. As I've said before, I'm not really an animator. Hell, I'm not even really an illustrator, in my eyes. And here I am drawing. When I watch the show, it occurs to me how hardworking and talented the people doing the keys are. These days there's a lot of freelance overseas work as well, so it's possible I even follow some of these people on socials and don't even realize it. Secondly, I'm not familiar with any of this beyond the episodes I've watched, so no manga knowledge. The heavy lean into referring to movies, for example, could be present in the manga and I wouldn't know it. I don't even know the creator's name, who I will look up now. Oh, that's a big strong fella. Gigi Akutami? No, it'd be like Gege, wouldn't it? I can't pronounce his name either, how fitting. Well, I'm known mainly for my painstaking hyper-analysis. I can't give you that here, because, I don't know enough. What I can say is that the generalized impression from someone not at all connected with an IP, as a first impression or casual viewer, has its own merits. After all, that's about 90% of the people that consume anything. So if you trust the insight that I have into other things, maybe I'll see something in this too. Or, maybe it'll help that toilet time go a little bit faster. Push! Eat more fiber! Push! Dig deep! If you don't care about spoilers and have never seen this and are still with me for whatever reason, the premise of the story is that there are sorcerers. Sorcerers have anime powers. Yuji eats the finger of Sukuna, the most evil, powerful sorcerer who ever lived, and as a result, is carting his soul around inside his body. Now he has to go to Tokyo Jujutsu High to not only learn about his new anime magic, but also to be observed by the staff because Yuji will absolutely be put to death one day, because it's the only way to completely destroy the bit of Sukuna that's actually still left. In other words, it's a show about going to a school for sorcerers. Now, as a point, there are almost no scenes of the characters going to class or learning anything. They certainly show up on the grounds. They meet the principal and the teachers. There's like 2 or 3 of them. But there are no Spider-Man gets his powers type scenes. There are no Harry Potter-styled Wingardium Leviosa scenes. The closest I can think of are a couple of times where they're doing gym or track and field exercises while they're hanging out. And there's also a bit where Gojo makes Yuji watch movies. Contrary to how most shonen-styled shows go, there's almost never any training segments. While the show is supposedly about going to a school for wizards, in practice it's just a place they wait for antagonists to attack them so the next sequence of fights can get animated. This isn't something that's wrong about the story. It's fine to have a premise that turns into something else. But it's part of a through line for how I feel the author thinks about what he's putting to paper. I feel like for him, the premise doesn't matter. It's the fights he's interested in. But the story itself also doesn't really matter. If you ask me what the story turns into, I couldn't really tell you either. There's a general tone and theme to events, but not exactly a message. The sorcerers themselves seem to be terrible people most of the time, and the way curse energy works seems to have a vague but equally generic messaging that humanity is dooming itself because there's too many humans and we mess up the environment and so on. You know, that sort of thing. But that's also fairly typical of a shonen. I couldn't tell you what Dragon Ball story is, other than Goku wants to eat and fight. So, you know, maybe the focus is on the main character. Who's our Goku? Yuji? Well, Yuji also doesn't really matter. He sort of does in the sense that he's a literal vessel for some of the basic plot points, but he doesn't have a lot of agency either. The events tend to center on individual fights of other characters, but he does fight too. But when he does, he almost always fails. In fact, I'd say the majority of his fights, he gets the absolute crap kicked out of him. Someone told me that the editors forced Yuji into the story and that the creator wanted Yuta or Megumi or someone to be the main character. I don't know if any of that is true. Plus, Yuta and Megumi both seem pretty boring, but that's neither here nor there. But Yuji eating dirt is fine. He learns something, right? Kind of? There's this odd thing that happens to him at the end of some fights where he'll start talking about his purpose in life and ambitions, although it wasn't really a focal point of the story of his characterization. It also has the anime convention of what he's saying being babbling pseudo-philosophical nonsense. You know, when characters, usually villains honestly, start talking about some vagary of how life works, and the more they talk, the more you realize that they're not saying anything. It's just empty, evocative language that's a placeholder for substance that the story doesn't actually have. You know, anime. Ultimately, as I recall, Yuji has this epiphany that he just needs to kill every curse he can find and let history worry about whether he's good or bad. Which seems to be the general problem with the sorcerers. They're amoral at best, and spend more time politicking amongst themselves than doing their supposed jobs. That's something I find that this story shares with Hunter x Hunter. In that show, one of the core lessons is that power and humanity aren't compatible. The more power you have, the less accountable you are. And the less people can hold you to account for your actions, the more inhuman and selfish your behavior becomes. Although that's a very structured, focused theme that succeeds because Togashi is such a good writer. Here it's more like an afterthought. You know, it's a cigarette that you smoke after all the action. JJK shares a lot in common with Hunter x Hunter, and I get the impression it influenced the mangaka a lot, although I don't know if that's true. The most obvious comparison I can make is the power system. Nen, famously, might be the best anime power system ever developed. You can basically custom fashion your own power, but it still requires sacrifices and balance. The more detrimental it is to you, the stronger it becomes. Even if you just learn the basics of Nen, you can overcome an enemy if it's a power you can only ever use on a single enemy, at the cost of your life if you violate that rule. In that way, every user has to custom design their own power, even if it's subconscious. And you can even mess up the design of the power by not setting outcomes, not dictating what the opponent even has to do, and so on. Something interesting about Nen, I'm about to chase a rabbit by the way, something interesting about Nen that I wish got brought up but never did, is that the power system works by leveraging what's important to the user, right? That is, if you don't want to die, if you say this power is way stronger, but if it misses, then I die, then the power gets way stronger. And if you say, I shoot an arrow at someone, but the arrow is stronger because it's blue, then nothing would happen, because the user knows that making the arrow blue doesn't really matter. That restriction is stupid and doesn't confer a risk. But what if the user was really dumb, and he had this conspiratorial thought that he was actually a robot, and his parents were paid actors that wanted to trick him into believing he was a real boy? So he designs a power with a restriction like, I fire an arrow, but if it misses, any mechanical part of my body is destroyed. To him, because he's an idiot, this means he would basically die. So does the power get stronger, or does nothing happen? It's like the Pinocchio paradox. Pinocchio says his nose will grow. Does it? The answer, of course, is that it depends on whether he believed it would grow or not. Nothing else matters. His nose only grows when he lies, and a lie depends on whether you believe it or not whether it's universally true. Whether the nose will grow or not is irrelevant, only whether Pinocchio is choosing to lie about the outcome that he believes in. Yeah, it's sort of like Warhammer 40,000 orcs. So for Nen, is being wrong part of designing a power? And if someone corrects you, does the power stop working? It's tied to your spirit, so it would have to, wouldn't it? Like Kurapika can use his chain jail only on members of the Phantom Troop. But what if he uses it on someone he's positive is a member of the troop, kills them, and then years later he gets information that the person was never related to the Spider organization? Does he just die on the spot? Or does he die as soon as he used the power years before? Or does he die slowly as he confirms the information or something? I like thinking about dumb things like this. Anyway, JJK lifts that concept of design once, kind of. If you explain your power to your enemy, it becomes more effective. You don't really see it become more effective. It's just a general statement that the show makes. Of course, the real reason for this is that it's just so that the characters can tell their opponents how their abilities work, so the audience has an explanation for what's happening. I found myself having that same question, though. What if you explain it, but the opponent didn't understand the explanation, or had cotton in their ears? What if you mumble the explanation? Does it still count? What if someone like me over-explains every element of it? Does it become a nuclear bomb because I won't shut up? Furthermore, oh my god, stop him, his power is a dissertation, he's going full PhD! Anyway, whereas Dragon Ball would have characters stand around and uselessly narrate what's happening to the audience, systems like this have a reason for fighters narrating their own powers. So, that's basically it. I saw people were talking up JJK's power system, but it doesn't really have one. It just has that one rule, and then later lots of other random, poorly explained details about specific moves that seem very arbitrary. A good example I can think of is that some of the Zenin family powers have this rule that you have to be doing something every 24 frames, which obviously is an animation joke. Technically, it would be 23.976 frames, as I recall, not 24, but whatever. But what is a frame in the context of the setting? And what defines an action or a motion? Everything in the universe is always in motion. We're made of atoms that are constantly in a state of activity, so it's impossible for any part of you to be completely still. Saying something isn't moving is a human judgment based on our limited perception, so is the power based on the judgment of a user or some outside force? And what defines what a second is in this case if we're subdividing them into 24 units? Scientifically, we had to define a second in time as the transition of a cesium-133 atom between two hyperfine energy states, because time itself is relative, and there's otherwise no way to define a unit of time. After all, if you move fast enough, your perception of an outsider's version of a second slows down while yours becomes very fast to them. If you go too fast, you end up traveling to the planet of the apes, and you don't want that, right? So, is it 24 subdivisions of that? Cesium-133 atom's transitional value? Or is it just stupid bullshit? Also, this is a bloodline power. Did your ancient Japanese ancestors decide on this 24 frame thing because they anticipated liking cartoons? What about that guy whose power was having a jet engine for hair? Did his ancestors have jet engines for hair in the Sengoku period? Obviously, you aren't supposed to take this stuff seriously. It's just a reference. But it's a good way of illustrating how the world building doesn't really matter. Only the pretext to having something cool happen matters. I was a bit surprised because people had been talking up how good of a system it was, only to discover it was mostly nonsense, and its good concepts were just stolen from the Nen system. But again, this is the through line for how the author seems to think. What's important is what's cool, and ideas exist to service whatever the immediate scene is, and after that, don't matter quite as much. That problem definitely extends to characters who all feel very disposable. Background characters to an insane degree seem to manifest out of thin air on a regular basis just to be murdered. I don't know how bad this is in the manga, but On a regular basis, fights will happen in population centers. Even during a crisis, random nobodies will appear within the fight so they can pop or get beheaded or be eaten or so on. This gets amped up even more later when the go-to move for curse villains is to create fenced-in people pens where thousands of animation victims can't get out, so there's always an excuse for why convenient blood bags aren't leaving the area. And even in these moments, fights will happen in subway tunnels or city streets for several minutes, and no one is leaving, despite dozens of people turning into red mist from invisible enemies that white-haired strangers seem to be fighting. You can stretch yourself to rationalize that, but again, my point is that these are disposable people. They exist like skyscrapers in Zack Snyder's Man of Steel. They aren't real, they're just debris for the characters to interact with. This is also true for not only background characters, but the core cast themselves. A sort of theme with the show is that the sorcerers are disposable people themselves. They do some horrible things even with good intentions, and as soldiers, they'll inevitably get killed, during a relatively meaningless situation or not. But usually in a story, you want to work up to that point. You establish a lot of details about a character so that we have context for why their death, whether it's meaningless or not, is tragic or fitting or inevitable or so on. Especially in war stories, having a main character suddenly die from a random headshot helps emphasize that seeming randomness of war, and that there are no main characters. So even if a death has no meaning, you still spend a lot of time developing that notion for the payoff. And that's why I chose to draw Maki, and I'll explain first. Jujutsu Kaisen has a lot of characters, and most of them are flat, two-dimensional people with quirky designs that exist long enough to use their weird power, then they die. Or in some cases use their lame power, because they aren't important, then they vanish from the story. Or they're supposed to be semi-important, but they come up once or twice, and then they also vanish from the narrative. Or they're semi-important, but never have any development. I think, what's his name? Togi Unumaki is a good example of that. His power is shouting words at people, but it seems to fail most of the time and nearly permanently injures him if he uses it more than twice. I couldn't tell you anything about his personality or backstory because he's living window dressing. His real purpose is to be a spice character that says nothing, but can be added to any scene like an ingredient to make it seem more active, since he has a single running gag he communicates with one word. So he doesn't actually have to really participate in anything. You can really probably make a short list of the characters the author seems to genuinely be interested in. Gojo is one, who I'll get to, don't you worry. Yuji by virtue of being the main character. Megumi is maybe the most boring nobody in the story that the author is absolutely obsessed with for some reason. He's a human rice cake. And even though she's sort of this series' Sakura, I hate to insult her, but in terms of the trio format, I don't know if I'd include Nabara. She exists as side comedy until the very end, where she quickly is given a more actualized backstory before being killed, then not killed, then killed again off screen, then I guess not killed. Although this seems mainly just due to the author no longer wanting to use her, so I'm not sure if he cares about her or not. Todo is probably the side character. I couldn't stand him at first, but I eventually came to appreciate the dedication to his stupid joke, as well as the visual creativity of his power, even if its application can be inconsistent sometimes. He's not a deep character at all, but he's certainly beloved because he's just dumb fun. Beyond that, I suppose Kento? I really like Kento Nanami, but he was definitely written to die. Make no mistake, this is exactly what needs to happen in a narrative, so I'm not complaining about him dying, beyond just not liking one of the characters that I enjoyed being removed from the story. The author seemed to like him, though, to some degree, which is my point. So in a show with about 100 characters, that's not a long list. And here I will remind you that this video is my first watch, initial takeaway of this show. I can't even remember or pronounce the names of the characters. I was watching about half of an episode a day at some points because I was too busy with other things, so a lot of these ideas are fragmentary. My perspective on everything always shifts on a second viewing, whether it's minor or not, and no manga knowledge. So again, the point of all this is that this is just an outside initial takeaway video. I don't know what the fanbase of this IP is like, so either I'm going to be held in contempt for all this, or people will nod and say that I'm basically on the right track. I have no idea. Anyway, character importance. Again, this is mainly because the series seems to be written for scenes, not arcs. One of the odder things about the show is that sometimes the whole narrative will stop, and there will be a prolonged sequence where the show becomes a totally different genre, and focuses on the life of some nobody, street-level person, or the mundane backstory of one of the cast. Or there will be some odd 3-minute-long rotoscope scene where they clearly are tracing out the characters over live actors. I love these scenes. These are my favorite parts of the story because they're the only moments where people feel like people and not toys. But these are moments, almost like writing exercises, to preface a ridiculous action sequence. It's not wrong, it's just odd because it proves the author can involve himself in ground-level humanity, but simply has no interest in thinking about it outside of these isolated moments. It's never incorporated into the overarching narrative, aside from the movie, I guess. So, Maki specifically, you might say, is someone the author likes and focuses on, but there are two Makis in this show. The first is just another background character. She's consistently in scenes and participates, but doesn't really feel vital to anything. There's also a somewhat thinly established detail that her twin sister resents her having left to try to impress her idiot family. It's there, but never felt important to anything. Still, that's fine, not everything has to be in the forefront. But it does lead to Maki number 2, who is the scarred, punished Maki that I'm drawing. Part of why I'm drawing her is because I'm doing this video about Snake Eater, its themes, and the relationship between Jack and the boss. Apparently that script is 71,247 words right now. Books tend to be 75,000 to 120,000 words, so if you're wondering, I've been basically writing a literal book for the past couple of months. Anyway, Maki 2.0 reminded me a lot of the boss, even if Maki 2.0 is supposed to be a Kill Bill reference for half of her screen time. Well, Maki 1.0 felt present but not terribly important. Maki 2.0 feels like the author watched a couple of cool films and got this idea for a completely unrelated character. Seeing Maki 1.0 nearby, mostly unused, he realized that her generic backstory could be appropriated for a cool set piece about a badass lady annihilating an entire mafia family. In this case, her own family. So, there's a very reserved, hastened sequence where the twin sister, who was never important at all, but I thought she was prettier, but also a massive asshole, is killed off with a vague explanation that she... Let me try to word this right. Her sister, Mai, sacrificed herself figuratively in a dream sequence to give her twin sister Maki what she needed to wipe out their family. This meant stripping her sister of her remaining curse energy once the twin died, because there's some vaguely explained special nature to twins relating to how curse energy works, or something. It has to have been explained better than that, but that is the impression that I got. But what is important is that this completely alters Maki's personality to match a brand new physical model she's being drawn with, so that she can have this badass sequence reminiscent of your favorite action films. Yeah, she's a new character. All humans have a little bit of curse energy, so having no curse energy at all makes you undetectable to other curse users. Also, there was another character from the film who made a Heavenly Pact, which is another power system detail that's never really explained, that gave him physical superpowers. Maki didn't make a pact, but she also gets physical superpowers that are not quite as good, I guess, for some reason. I guess her sister somehow gave her the powers? Even though both of them were very weak and Mai was basically dead already when it happened. I don't know. You get what I'm going for here. I don't have a problem with the action sequence or the new design of Maki or anything, really. I mean, it's a great episode. Very cool. I'm just pointing out that the story doesn't care about anything other than having enough window dressing and disposable people to hand-wave why we're getting our next cool thing. So in my takeaway of JJK, this is what I kept coming back to. In almost every scene, it was this strange juxtaposition of semi-care and narrative ambivalence. The power system is sort of developed, but makes no sense because the author doesn't want to nail anything down. The characters are sort of developed, but it often goes nowhere because the author clearly doesn't care to focus on it for any longer than a few minutes. And the overall theme is sort of developed, but the framing of any development is meandering and empty because the author clearly doesn't think about what he writes as having any message. This isn't Dragon Ball, which is totally vapid and has basically no substance whatsoever. But it also isn't something like Free Run, to use a recent example, which will eschew major fights and events because it wants to explore the world and character interactions, and has no interest in the fighting. It's something in the middle that feels like someone writing Dragon Ball and being told by an editor that they need to at least establish something to give a damn about. This is what I found interesting about the experience of watching the show as a first-time viewer. It led me to wonder if there was some greater backstory to the show's development. After all, a massive amount of money went into realizing this thing. This story is an anime, and I couldn't figure out why. There's nothing special about the story in any way, or the setting, or the characters. This was animated on the cheap by a deer trapped in the headlights at JC Staff or something. You know, the One Punch Man Season 3 treatment. Then no one would care. It gives me a similar reaction I had to watching Demon Slayer. I really liked the very first episode of Demon Slayer because it felt like a very tone-focused period drama about life in an undeveloped, mysterious world that our ancestors would have seen as being supernatural. But then after a few minutes, I realized it was just junk that had a lot of money pumped into making CG sword animations. It left me wondering, why do they finance such a mediocre idea? I sort of liked JJK, but I couldn't get through Demon Slayer. I thought Demon Slayer was just that, painfully mediocre and undeserving of its investments. If I had to make a direct comparison of JJK to another well-known anime, I'd probably compare it to Bleach. And I say Bleach because Kubo was also known to have that problem. He was really preoccupied with making stylish, cool-looking things, but he just didn't seem to care about the story in relative terms. This is pretty common with the artists. For the complete package of something like a comic or a manga, you need good art, good writing, good characters, good marketing, good production, good corporate, and most people can't do all that stuff. For most people, you might be good at marketing your writing and dealing with production and sales, but your art might suck. I mean, look at One. His art is terrible, like hilariously terrible to the point that I kind of love it, but that's not the point. Then you might have people that are amazing writers, okay artists, who can't market themselves, or amazing art and terrible writing and so on. With Kubo, his power system, characters, and overall messaging sort of had things going on as ideas, but his focus was clearly always on just making cool shit. You know, before the burnout, then again after the burnout. And I get a similar vibe from Gege, I guess his name is. Someone who can't plan long term, probably doesn't care about arcs or theming, and just wants to make cool shit. Which for the world of shonen, who cares? Especially when it's lavishly animated. If it hits, it hits. Again, this isn't a complaint video, it's more of a mystified by the questions I have video. This is part of my brand. When I like something, I tend to start asking lots of questions about it that sound like complaining, hence why I chose this name. Anyway, to close things out, we'll have a special treat and talk a moment about Gojo. He's the reason I chose to watch the show, because I got the impression he was some arrogant dipshit that wins every fight because his cute little power was busted, but then gets humiliated eventually. And it ended up being mostly true? Something I've been itching to complain about, not analyze or contemplate, just complain about in this case, is how all the powers in this series are tied to bloodlines. This seems to be a cultural thing, I think. In the US, we're obsessed with the idea of underdogs and gaining power from nothing. In practice, that doesn't happen. The powerful here are born into power and gain more and more of it because that's how power works. But that's also part of why we love the idea of someone who has nothing humiliating the people at the top. In Japanese stories, there's much more of a focus on honoring family and responsibilities you have towards whatever you were born into. Which makes sense, I guess. Conformity, the nail that sticks up is hammered down, and so on. I've mentioned this several times in my Dragon Ball and Hunter x Hunter videos, but boy, I greatly dislike the idea of people being born inherently better than everyone else. Nothing turns me against a character faster than the author telling me that they're one in a billion talents, or that their family has a long and storied history of excellence, and they owe all their potential to their ancestors. You know, whatever. To hell with their ancestors. Trust fund potential pisses me off. And that's exactly how powers work in this setting. You have kids, and you cross your fingers and pray that your busted superpower genes get passed down to them. And they end up inheriting the exact same power that you had. And they can develop it and make it even better. And if they didn't get your power, you get characters like Maki and Mai, who are treated like garbage by their own family because they were born as disappointments. And if they did get passed down, you get characters like Gojo, who are so inherently gifted that literally the entire plot revolves around them. It's sort of like if Goku was still a main character, but not the direct focus of Dragon Ball. Like if the show was about, Trunks or someone, and then sometimes Goku would show up and just resolve all the problems with almost no effort. In JJK, this comes back to that same issue of people being completely disposable. If you're a character that matters, you get an interesting, quirky power. If you don't matter, your power either doesn't exist, or just sucks. I thought a funny example of this was when Maki 1.0 was turning into Maki 2.0. She confronts her father, loses instantly, gets rewritten into Kill Bill Maki, and then goes back to fight him again. And despite her father being one of the heads of the whole Zenin clan, which itself is one of the big 3 clans in Japan, his power is just moving quickly and making his katana fling out generic energy. And his power is pretty underwhelming, because I think that was the point. He was a character you never see until he shows up to get killed, so why waste a power on him? His job was to be quickly hateable, then die to start off this cool action sequence. Gojo is the epitome of this problem. In a setting where cool matters more than character, there isn't a lot to Gojo beyond his broken power. His power set is your standard superhuman ability, of course. He's also a Naruto type and has huge wells of cursed energy because he's so special. And also is insanely perceptive and just knows everything that's happening around him, so he can be cool and know you're watching him or whatever. And of course, his inherited bloodline technique, which lets him control space at an atomic level. Again, there must have been a very talented scientific community in ancient Japan. The basic version of the power makes it so that he's constantly surrounded in infinity, which I will point out, if you're surrounded by infinite space, that means relativistically, you would also have infinite mass and energy, which would make Gojo collapse into a singularity or some sort of superpositional state. But whatever. You could try to explain this any number of ways, but again, referring back to what we've already discussed, it's just dumb nonsense, and it's only supposed to be cool, which again, is fine. Then he also has a version of the power called Blue, where instead of stopping things, he pushes things. He also has a power called Red, where instead of stopping things, he pulls things. And you're not gonna believe this. You'd have to be a real genius to figure this one out. But the most advanced version of this is mixing red and blue to make purple. And purple, I guess it pushes and pulls? They don't really say. But it's basically just a Dragon Ball Ki Blast. Also, he can heal himself and neutralize ultimate attacks and trap people in infinite information and other such nonsense. Basically, he's kitted out with a bunch of elementary schoolyard, "No, I beat that too" stuff. As far as his character goes, he's kind of developed, for a JJK character anyway. He is indeed arrogant and often amoral and pragmatic about his tactical outcomes. I do appreciate that. But he will go out of his way to protect people if he can. When I started the series, I didn't know if he was a villain or not, since I never really saw anything about the guy that suggested he was a good person. He definitely has this "I'm better than you" air about him all the time, and the only thing that grounds him at all is the movie canon involving Suguru. Other than that, I honestly get tired of looking at him, hearing about him, and having the whole show revolve around trying to seal him, break him out, ask for his help, avoid him noticing you, and so on. In another case of the author inventing something for a single scene, there's one thing that I can recall countering his power, and it's this random guy's rope he brought with him from Africa. It neutralizes his power somehow. After the fight, they say it got too damaged to use, and there's a brief scene of them asking for another one, and the tribe that makes it shrugs and says, "We don't have any." And that whole scene lasts like a few seconds. In other words, the author realized he had to explain why this broken item can no longer be used as a plot device anymore. Sort of like time turners in Harry Potter, I guess. You just gotta destroy them all. So, Gojo? Whatever. I don't really like him. Anytime he uses his power, I find myself asking how anyone can see or hear him if he's surrounded by infinity. Which makes me imagine just pumping a bunch of CO2 into his room and letting science take care of him. You don't have to explain how CO2 works to make it stronger. It just works. I'm sure the cursed plot magic would protect him, though. No elementary school playground is safe from Gojo, king of making up shit on the spot. I felt like in terms of overall impression, the high point of the story of JJK was probably the movie, which makes sense because it had to be a packaged narrative with a directed point and realized characters. The twist with the little turdling, what's his name? Yuta, I think. The twist at the end didn't impress me much since it's pretty well telegraphed. But I was most impressed with Suguru's slow fall to becoming a murderer, because it was very grounded and relatable for the setting and how things work in it. I think I was especially surprised I had a good impression of him in the movie, because of how much I hated him prior to that. I can't stand most of the villains in JJK. The stupid patchwork curse idiot is the quintessential version of that. A lot of the villains are allowed to be horrid piles of waste for really long stretches of time, do horrible things to vast amounts of people, act like spoiled little brats, or the anime version of a 12-year-old kid with an Xbox headset. Then when it comes time for their big comeuppance, when somebody gets to pay them back for all the things they've been getting away with, nothing happens. I was ready for the patchwork thing to die the second that I saw him. My initial thought was, oh, that thing looks stupid. I bet it's going to be annoying. And yeah, it was. Sure enough, the entire series is spent orbiting all the scenes of how miserable he gets to make things for everyone, all the while with a moronic grin on his face that the viewer naturally wants to punch right in the teeth. But all you get is a few big hits, and Yuji slowly walking after him, which results in him being absorbed, which effectively means he's now alive forever. Great. A similar thing happens with another annoying villain. I'll have to search online to figure out what his name is. Stupid-looking loser who gets killed multiple times. Haruta Shigemo, apparently? Looking at his picture makes me angry. What the hell is he wearing? It looks like a trash bag he's tried to style into a one-suspender pair of overalls. I can't help but imagine crushing his windpipe anytime I look at him. I have my criticisms of the author, the general writing methodology, but he knows how to make a hateable, stupid villain you want to see get eviscerated. But they just don't get the punishment they deserve. This guy I thought of because it's as close as it ever gets. There's this weird sequence where the viewer is dipping in and out of what's happening with him, and it results in Kento Nanami getting a hold of him. And Nanami is allowed to manhandle and humiliate this dumb kid for a while before the scene cuts away. Then later, Haruta, or whatever his name is just wandering around like nothing happened. so naturally I kept rewinding because I felt like I was missing a scene. It's explained later that he has a power that he doesn't even know he has, where if he dies, it doesn't count and he just revives, as long as he has a mark under his eye. Whether the author planned this or not in advance, I don't know, but it's a concept for this one scene, because then that last mark is used so that he can die so quickly that the character doesn't even register that he's not getting away with everything that he's done. You get what I mean? Even when the villains die, they either don't really die or there's no satisfaction in them being punished. The ones that do die directly are never the hateable ones. That's why I cling to this scene of Nanami terrorizing this little chump. It's one of the few times it's ever briefly satisfying, and ends too quickly and even results in Nanami getting killed later on. I would have liked the whole episode to have been him figuring out how this guy's revival power worked, and then spending the entire runtime of the episode exploiting it. Like doing run-up sprinting kicks to his nads so hard that his balls popped or something. So that he'd start wailing and thrashing around in the mud, eating the mud because he's howling in pain, just writhing around crying. And then Nanami would find a horse manure pile and be like, I'll give you something to cry about. And then force his head down to choke on a whole manure pile while he's thrashing around, crying and grabbing at his exploded little groin. Yeah, like normal stuff like that. That's what should happen to Jujutsu Kaisen villains. But that's just how it goes on this bitch of an earth. Anyway, that's my review of JJK. Maki's pretty great too. Well, she stops farting around and gets burned by Lava Man. After she gets the scars, then she's acceptable. I also didn't mention it, but I appreciate the creativity and general uniqueness of the random curses. Just like the monsters that they fight every so often. They're never a threat to anybody, but I like them. Alright, back to producing this 7-hour-long video. I'm still alive, I'm just very, very tired, because I'm effectively writing a book in the span of 3 months. The last time I wrote a book, it actually took a year. A little bit over a year, and then more than that to do the cover letter and the manuscript and all that other stuff. Doing it all in 3 months has been absolutely insane. Anyways, I'll see you guys next time, which hopefully will be soon.